Okay, so now we have Dr. Marcus Rowcliffe from the Institute of Zoology at the Zoological Society of London. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. So, here we go. So, I'm going to start off with perhaps a slightly invidious comparison, although actually I noticed Julian made the same comparison with birds and how easy birders have it, Phil, relative to many other groups. And I'm going to be talking about what we can do with technology to make things a bit easier when we're trying to understand what's going on in the mammal communities that we want to know more about. So birds, obviously, as we know, they're visible, they're noisy, you can see them everywhere. That makes them really engaging. People get involved in them, and there's armies of people out there who know loads about birds and can feed that information back, and that gives us fantastic information about what's going on. In contrast, for mammals, what you get very often, they're kind of nocturnal, they're often a bit sneaky, quite shy, quite hard to see. So you get these kind of rather fleeting, poor sightings of them. A lot of what we know tends to come from more of these kind of Victorian naturalist skills that we heard about at the beginning, just by looking at their signs, their droppings, their prints, and increasingly flattened corpses on roads, that sort of thing. So we know something about what's going on with our mammal populations from these things, but it's not nearly as good as what we have for birds. So at the BTO, Phil's organization, and other organizations coordinating amazing monitoring schemes, so we have fantastic information like this. So to pick a random example for the willow warbler, we know in an immense amount of detail what's happened to the populations for pretty much all of our bird species over many decades. In contrast, we get a much sketchier picture of what's going on with many mammal populations. So to pick another random example, this is just some of the best information I could quickly dredge up for hedgehog, for example. And it's just a very sketchy indication of what's happening to the population in terms of the percentage of grid squares across the country where we have records for hedgehog. Now, that's not a very good indication of trend when you look at what we have for birds. So how can we improve things? So a key tool that we now have that's been developed for this is the camera trap. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with these. They're not actually, by modern standards, very advanced devices, really. But there's reasons why they're becoming much more important in science and natural history in general, which I'll go into shortly. Essentially, a camera trap is, as I'm sure you all know, a camera. So we've got within this nice watertight casing here, we've got a camera and the lens looking out there. Connected to that, crucially, we've got a passive infrared sensor. So that's essentially the sort of thing that switches on your security light just outside your house. Detects motion, heat, changes in heat essentially in front of the camera, triggers the camera, and then also we have a flash. Everything's fine by day, but of course, a lot of the species we're interested in are active by night, so we need some sort of illumination. This model happens to have a white flash. You can also get infrared, which is much less disturbing for the wildlife. So, huge range of these things now on the market. Pretty cheap. You can get them for as little as £100 or so per unit or less. And that's had an incredible effect on the extent to which these are being used. So, to understand that effect, maybe it's interesting to have a little look at the history of camera trapping. So, I think, as I'll show you what camera traps can do, there's a lot of new stuff coming up, but camera traps themselves are absolutely not new. So this is a timeline going along the bottom here across the 20th century, and the first use of camera traps, well, arguably they go back to the middle of the 19th century when Edward Maybridge did those classic pictures of galloping horses. That was the animal itself tripping the camera using physical tripwires. The first use that I'm aware of to get pictures of wild animals was a chap called George Shiraz, who published in 1906 a series of wildlife pictures from Panama in the National Geographic. So, for example, he got that tremendous picture of a puma, which was, at the time, the first picture of its kind for that animal in the wild. So that was really quite revolutionary. Again, it was a tripwire setup, so really kind of low tech, although making use of the best photographic equipment at the time. Incredibly bulky, not really a scientific tool. That was very much a publicity and interest type thing, so not producing data as such. As you go through the 20th century, increasingly people tried to use new technology as it came along to improve and use it for science. So for example, these two chaps here, Abbott and Coombs, developed something that we're very proud to say was portable. It weighed about 50 pounds, but not something you're going to mass produce. But they used this to do some quite interesting science on the activity patterns of small rodents in the wild. And they published a paper on that. And lots of details on how they put this camera together and so on. But not surprisingly, it wasn't picked up as a mass tool. It really didn't get used widely after them. What really revolutionized things was towards the end of the century, in the 90s, in the United States, in fact, the hunting market. So the technology got such that you could produce these very small, compact, watertight units, mass produce them, make them very cheap as the cameras became miniaturized, the sensing technology became better and cheaper. And these were mass produced essentially for the hunting market so that hunters could check out where the big bucks were, figure out where they're going to go and hunt best. So as a spin-off from that, scientists then have access, and interested naturalists have access to these things, not for hunting, but for understanding the natural history of wildlife, which hitherto has been very difficult to really get a good handle on. So the effects of that can be easily seen if I plot the number of papers that have been published using camera traps over the 20th century. And what we see is just this incredible takeoff. Nothing happening over the early century. There was one paper in the 20s, actually. There was a real pioneering effort there. This one in the 60s from Abbott and Coombs. And then as these mass-produced, affordable units come on the market, bang, everything goes crazy. Everybody's using camera traps. And there's amazing things going on. We can do all sorts of things that were very difficult before. So I'm going to show you a few of those things and what the sort of work that I've been developing. I'm going to try and persuade you that I think we're on the verge of a broader revolution, not just within the professional academic community, but how this can be spread to a broader participation by wider interested naturalists, and how that can feed into improving our understanding at a large scale of mammal populations. Okay, so what can we do with camera traps? Well, the first thing actually is not a scientific reason for using camera traps. It's simply to do with engagement. So I spoke earlier about birds being very easy to interact with. There's lots of people involved. Mammals, you have to be a bit more of a specialist. You have to be used to maybe not seeing your species so often and just going by signs. Very important skills, but it doesn't get so many people involved. So just to give you an example of this, last week I was in India setting up a survey. And we'd been there for several days, and it was in a tiger reserve, so obviously I wanted to see tigers, really excited about that. We'd seen one really fleeting glimpse late at night of a tiger, nothing much so far. So we thought we'd try and get a better handle of what was going on out there, put out a dozen camera traps overnight, really short survey, but just to see if we could get a better handle on what was happening in the area with the tiger population. Came back the next morning, and 6 of those cameras, half of them, had pictures of different tiger individuals. So we had a really good idea, very quickly, much better than we had by direct sightings. So this is the sort of pictures we were getting. And the engagement and the excitement from that, just from that's not data really, that's just an idea of what's going on around you. The excitement that you get from that is incredible. That's in India, yeah, tigers, really, really exciting, of course. But you can get the same sort of buzz from camera trapping in the UK. So this is in a patch in Devon that I'm very familiar with. And this is just, again, very casual camera trapping, getting some really nice images of, like this, of roe deer moving through the area. And it's a place I spend a lot of time in. I occasionally see roe deer there, but not very often. They don't seem to be that common. But when I do this sort of casual camera trapping, I get these sort of pictures. I can look at them with my kids. they get excited, you get a much better feeling for what's going on. And there's all sorts of other animals that you can see this way that you don't very often see. So that's, I think, the first thing to say about camera traps is that they're just really engaging and exciting, and they get people involved. They're an accessible way to look at mammals in your backyard. Okay, so what about the science? What can we do with camera trap information in a scientific sense? Well, the first thing to say about them is that you get these permanent verifiable records. So they give you, they're like voucher specimens, if you like, for your records in a museum sense. And if there's any uncertainty about what you're getting, you can get experts in to check it out. You can discuss endlessly what they actually mean and what species they are. But you have that permanent record there, so that can be that instantly is a more robust sort of scientific bit of information than perhaps just relying on expert opinion and trying to figure out whether the person telling you that they've seen something is reliable or not. You get quantitative data, so we know how many records we get of a particular species, we know where it is, we know how long the camera's been left out for, so the effort is quantified. So a lot of the problem with sort of presence-absence surveying is, of course, that you don't necessarily get the information on the absences, actually, because somebody tells you that they saw something somewhere. That's great, you know it was there, but there's whole areas where you don't have information of presence. You don't know if it's because people just haven't been as active there. With cameras, you quantify that effort very precisely. It's very easy to get a much more quantitative picture of relative or even absolute abundance of species using these methods. And then you can also get some really nice information on aspects of animal behavior, which can be very hard to observe. So just to give you an example, I've been doing a lot of camera trapping also in Panama, where we have a really nice system. We've been essentially running 20 camera traps there for over a year, so we're getting a very intensive set of data there on what's happening. And I'll show you some examples of what we're doing with those data. But one of the things we get is these occasional clips of just behavior, animals doing what they do in the wild, undisturbed. So this is an ocelot. It came and lay down there for 5 minutes, had a kip, woke up, nice big stretch, and went off again. And that was sort of in the middle of nowhere. We kind of assumed that these animals might be finding somewhere quite undercover to go to sleep, but he just went to sleep right there in the open, pretty much. So that's kind of interesting. It's an anecdote, but you can get those sort of really interesting little snippets of behavior using camera traps. We can do something a lot more quantitative in terms of behavior, though. So one thing that we can do is actually measure animal activity. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so well, first off, why would we want to measure activity? Well, activity is a fundamental distinction between active and non-active, has fundamental implications for the way that animals use energy, and how they partition their activity can affect the risk that they face in terms of predation, starvation, running into competitors, that sort of thing. So it's a very fundamental ecological currency that we might want to know something more about. It's quite difficult to measure, though. In the field, there are methods. They tend to be quite invasive. They don't get widely applied across huge ranges of species. But with camera traps, I think there are ways that we can begin to start doing that haven't been available before. So the fundamental thing about camera traps is that an animal has to be active and moving around for you to get a record. And then once we have those records, we can fit models to them, which I'll demonstrate in a minute, that enable us to quantify the amount of activity. So imagine you've got the daily cycle here from midnight through midday to midnight again. So we have an animal that crops up in the middle of the day here. We get another record just in the early afternoon, early morning, another one here. Leave the cameras out for maybe a few weeks or more, depending on how common the animal is. And we get a whole load of records like that. And we can look at the frequency of those records over the daily cycle. And we can see, for this species, this is a fictitious example, but we can see that this looks really very much like a diurnal species. So just some examples of that from the Panama data set. We've got two rodents, a diurnal one, agouti, nocturnal paca, and peccaries, which are active throughout the day to some extent, but with these big dawn-dusk peaks. So very nice information there about how they're partitioning their activity. We can also fit these flexible circular models to the data, so these red lines here. What this enables us to do is actually quantify aspects of the behavior. So one key thing that we can do is look at the area under those curves, and if we equate those, the height of those the peaks there to the amount of activity that's going on in the population, we can actually quantify from that the overall proportion of time that animals spend active. So, for example, agoutis, 28%, paca 32, peccary 37. There seems to be some sort of gradient there. And we can say with some statistical confidence whether those differ. And we can ask questions about the ecological effects that might influence the amount of activity that there is in the population. And we can ask about things like when they go to bed, when they get up, that sort of thing. Again, with some statistical confidence using these models. To give you an example of that in application, we've looked at the predator-prey interactions between ocelots and agoutis. So this is a major, important ecological relationship in this system. Agoutis are one of the major seed predators and dispersers in this system. Ocelots are their main predator. So we want to know if we want to predict the longer-term effects of changes and disturbances potentially in this ecosystem. For example, what happens if you remove the predator? The activity patterns and the way that these two species interact is one of the crucial links that we might want to understand. So here's the question that we were interested in. How do agoutis balance predation and starvation risks? And how can we understand, or how can we use the information that we have on activity to get a better handle on that? So here are the activity patterns for agouti in the solid line, this diurnal pattern again, and in the dotted line, ocelots. So ocelots, some activity throughout the day, but particularly at night, strangely. Their main prey species, they don't seem to be synchronizing on that. We're not quite sure why that is, but anyway, that seems to be what's happening. They still eat an awful lot of agoutis, but the risky time, the time when there are the most ocelots per agouti, are obviously into the night. So if you're an agouti, you're going to have to take serious risks if you're getting up early. But what we find is that there are some individuals in the population that do that. They get up early and they go to bed late. And the reason for that seems to be because they've got bad territories with not much food in. So they have to make this trade-off between starvation and predation. So this is a plot of the proportion of their time that they spend in these risky periods into the evening, as a function of the amount of fruit that they have within their home range. And these poor old individuals with really rubbish territories at the bottom here, they're having to spend a lot of time in this really risky area. So that's a really kind of interesting insight that we get from the camera trapping data that allows us to sort of understand these kind of ecological interactions much better than we did before. So that's a sort of one example of how we're trying to make more use of camera trapping data, not simply just getting images, but getting quantitative information that we can use to answer ecological questions. We can also look at animal speed. So I've shown you a couple of videos already of animals moving. Here are a few more, just across the few more different species. That was a brocket deer. These are coati. This is an armadillo, again from the Panama data. This is a tyra, big mustelid. This is the paca, again, big nocturnal rodent, about 8 kilos. And then tinamou, honorary mammal, if you like. So just to say that actually, I'm not just talking about mammals, but I'll come back to that. So what's going on here is that we're measuring, when we come to pick up the images, we can see where the animal's been on the ground in front of the camera, measuring that distance, and using that to get an estimate of the speed of the animal. Just to quickly go back to the birds, things like game birds, which are primarily terrestrial, of course, all of these methods will work equally. So I guess I'm talking about mammals and honorary mammals, if you like. Okay, so that was one measure of speed for that animal. We get lots of these little snapshots. We can actually build up a good data set on the distribution of speeds. And this is, again, another window on the energetics of animals that we can use to start getting a good understanding of how animals are limited, perhaps, in their distribution and abundance. So field metabolic rate is actually a really hard thing to measure. There are good ways of getting a direct measure of this through doubly labeled water, for example, but it is very invasive, expensive, difficult to do. We can't really do that very widely, but nonetheless, it's an important thing to try and understand if we want to understand what's limiting populations. By getting a lot of these measures of speed, we can build up a picture of how fast animals go and the distribution of that, what proportion of time an animal spends at a given speed when it's active. So this is the pattern for agouti. This is a log scale distribution of the speeds in meters per second. There are very good empirical relationships between speed and energy use. So this is what we would expect for an agouti in terms of energy consumption by speed. And if we integrate across those two relationships, we can get a good idea of how much energy agoutis are using in their daily cycle. And we can look at that, for example, between the different territories which these animals are using. We can start to build predictions about what sort of levels of food an animal needs to persist in the environment and start to build that into models of overall population persistence. So this is opening up whole new possibilities that we've only just begun to explore, really, for looking at this across whole suites of species rather than just the cherry-picking the odd one or two that we've been lucky enough to be able to do doubly labeled water with, for example. We can put these two things together. So I've talked about activity and I've talked about speed. Essentially, that's speed whilst active. So if you put those together, you can build up a picture of the long-term distance that an animal moves per day, for example. And that can be a useful measure, another useful ecological metric. It's been measured through telemetry in the past, and people have, from time to time, been interested in that and how that changes in time and space and across species. But we don't have all that many measures if you look in the ecological literature because it's quite hard to measure. There's only a limited number of species that have been tracked in sufficient detail. But now we have measures of speed whilst active and proportion of time active. You can put those together and get a measure of the daily distance traveled using in a population by a population of animals using camera trap data. And these measures we found for the Panama data match very much what we would expect from the previous radio tracking information. So this is a plot of the day range for a whole suite of species. Each of these points is a species versus the size of that species, the body mass. And this positive relationship is exactly what previous studies have found empirically. And also the fact that the carnivores and insectivores, faunivores in general, tend to be, for a given body mass, tend to move further. Again, that's exactly what we would expect from both theoretical and previous empirical work. So it seems to be giving us some really good possibilities for looking at this metric of quite important metric as well. So what can we do in terms of distribution and abundance? So I've spoken so far primarily about kind of behavioral measures, what we can get from camera trapping data that will tell us about animal behavior. I started off thinking more about distribution and abundance, and of course cameras are going to give us that sort of information. They're put down in a specific location at a specific time, and so we should be able to use that information to improve our information about animal distribution and abundance. So one simple thing that you can do with camera trap data is simply to look at whether or not you see animals. So we have true presence-absence data for this now, and there are various methods by which we can either just use the raw information or try to look at the detectability by looking at the way that records accumulate over time. And an example of this is these sort of maps that are started coming out from the TEAM database. So the TEAM is the Tropical Ecology Assessment and Monitoring. It's a network of organizations who've come together to set up a suite of permanent long-term monitoring plots across the tropics. It's one of the least known areas, although with this camera trapping, long-term camera trapping information, I think it's the tropical mammal communities are set to become much less poorly known. So this is the sort of information that you can now get. This is a trapping grid in Costa Rica. And for a suite of species, we can see ocelot, tapir, brocket deer, and agouti, similar to the ones that we were looking at in Panama. You've got these heat maps of relative probability of presence across the area that was camera trapped. So if we think about scaling this up, potentially, we've got instantly a much more quantitative and better, robustly, statistically robust way of looking at animal distribution than we have at the moment with the rather piecemeal methods that we have for trying to put together mammal records. We can also, this doesn't really tell us so much about abundance necessarily. Probably it's correlated, the distribution is correlated with abundance, but very often we also want to know what the size of our population is. That's a very critical ecological parameter. And we can do that with camera trapping in a couple of different ways at the moment. So the first one is that we can get absolute abundance by using spatially explicit capture-recapture if we have recognizable individuals. So your tiger is going back to that example, the classic example of this. The stripes are absolutely diagnostic of the individual. We could potentially do that in the UK, perhaps with fallow deer. I don't think it's been tried yet as far as I know, but that's potentially possible. It's not going to be possible for most species, though, because we don't have those individually recognizable markings. So what can we do there? Well, there's something like the badger. We have a new method which I've been developing, which I've called the random encounter model, which basically works on the principle that if you have cameras distributed randomly with respect to the animals, there should be a strict physical relationship between the density and the number of records that you get, or the trap rate there. So if you have the trap rate, you should be able to extract that density signal. So there are a number of other things, of course, that affect the trap rate. Where you put the camera, if it's in a place that's good or bad for the animals. You can get around that by placing the camera randomly with respect to animal movement. The speed of the animal, but as I showed you, you can quantify that using the camera trap data itself, and how far the camera can see, and that's a relatively easy thing to measure, so the size of the detection zone. So just to give you an illustration of how this works in principle, I've set up some little simulations. So this is what happens. So the little green circles are cameras, if you imagine. The black dots are animals. Hopefully this is going to start. Oh, no, they're not running. OK, that was supposed to. OK. I don't think that's going to run. No, not to worry. So basically what this was illustrating was that there should be a strict physical relationship between the number of records that you get in a given amount of time, the density of animals, so whether they're scarce or densely populated, whether they're slow or fast, how fast they move, and whether your camera trap detection zone is small, as here, or big, as here. And it turns out there's a relatively simple relationship between all of those parameters, so it is possible mathematically to extract a density signal from your trap rate and given estimates of your detection zone and animal speed, which we can do. So we trialed this in the Panama data, and this is a test of that method. So this is a plot of the density using the random encounter model against independent estimates of density using standard methods, either mark recapture or visual transects using distance sampling, depending on the species. And you can see the pink line is the one-to-one fit, and we're getting broadly, so it says definitely some departures, but broadly speaking, we're getting very good correspondence between REM and other methods. So this is a new method coming through that potentially will give us a lot better scope for estimating animal abundance using camera traps, even where we can't identify individuals. OK, so that's a very brief overview of the kind of work that I'm involved in to develop camera trapping methods. Just want to end by thinking a bit about where this could take us in terms of larger scale mammal monitoring in the UK or more broadly. So I think there's huge potential here, of course, which isn't currently being realized. So given the methods that I've showed you, though, I think in principle we could end up with what I would like to see us aiming for are these kind of trend plots, not for birds only, but for mammals as well. So for example, let's just replace that with badger. I guess that's probably not an unrealistic trend for badgers the way things are going, but that's another story. So the question is, how do we get there? Okay, so how can we move mammal monitoring into the sort of place that bird monitoring has been for a long time and get much better information on trend? What do we need for that? So first off, we need to widen participation. It's not going to be the way that bird monitoring got into the state it is through mass participation, lots of voluntary, skilled voluntary field power, people getting out there, submitting data, getting involved in the BTO scheme and others, schemes that feed the information into this trend information. So we need the same sort of thing for mammals, and I think, as I indicated, the engagement angle is a very good way to get more people involved in that. We have the methods now to start building that kind of information into robust, statistically robust trend information like that. And so kind of what my vision, I guess, is that just as every self-respecting naturalist now has at least one pair of binoculars, so I think maybe we should all have camera traps to use when we get the chance and build that into systems. So not just people doing that individually, but coordinating that in the way that we have coordinated bird monitoring schemes. So setting up systems for people to feed camera trap information into in a directed, robust way so that we can start to build up that kind of picture. And then, of course, integrating with existing programs. So there are things starting up. The Mammal Society, as I'm sure many of you know, has a camera loan scheme where you can borrow cameras and start building things up. But so things are starting to build up. But one of the things that I'm interested in trying to stimulate really is a kind of quicker uptake of that so we can move quickly into large-scale monitoring schemes, building camera trap data into getting a much better picture of what's happening to our mammal populations. So one thing I'd be very interested in discussing when we come to the questions or any time during lunch breaks or whatever is people's thoughts on how this might work, whether people are already doing this, to what extent it's already happening. I know a lot of people are just starting to do their own camera trapping, but how we build that into better systems, what are the impediments to doing that, and what are the opportunities. So I hope we can have a bit of a discussion about that later. So thank you very much.